the way we've set up an economic story to be repeatedly accelerating our avarice means I think we're all formed into being hypocrites. And Oliver James, who is not religious at all, as far as I know, talks about this a lot in Affluenza, that one of the key ways that he talks about Affluenza as a virus, this insatiable hunger for more and more and more, and never being satisfied with enough, having no concept of enough, that forms of religious practice are one of the only known antidotes to Affluenza. Because the claim, and it's a truth claim, of my tradition is not only that money won't make you happy, but that it is dangerous for your soul.
I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan, and this is Beauty at Work, the podcast that seeks to expand our understanding of beauty, what it is, how it works, and why it matters for the work we do. This season of the podcast is sponsored by John Templeton Foundation and Templeton Religion Trust. Hey everyone, this is the second half of my conversation with Elizabeth Oldfield about her new book, Fully Alive, Tending to the Soul in Turbulent Times. Please check out the first half of our conversation if you haven't already. In the first part, we talked about Elizabeth's journey to writing a book that aims at unpacking the resources that religion can offer all of us for helping us pursue our yearning for connection and wholeness. In this episode, she talks in particular about how to move from polarization to peacemaking, from greed to generosity and gratitude, and how to overcome our unhealthy individualism. Let's get started. Say a little bit about some of those practices, because you talk a lot about practices in the book. And are there things you might recommend to people who are in that position of saying, gosh, I'm intrigued by these spiritual experiences that others are having. I've never had anything like it. I don't think I can get myself to believe there's anything more than atoms and molecules. What do I do?
Honestly, my advice is so basic that people find it quite shocking. Go to church. And if like the Christian bit is massively off-putting for you, that's where I'm coming from. That's my mother tongue. Yeah. Go somewhere else, but go to a religious congregation and be there for a while. Like, I think the way we think about spirituality in the West at the moment is hyper individualized. And this is very, very, very unworked out. But the next thing I want to be working on is how central the collective is in religious traditions, and therefore how collective formation is the thing that really changes us. I think when we pay attention in the same way with other people, it has massively more power than just like lighting a candle in our room. And I'm not dismissing any of this. Meditation is good.
Sure.
Like those mystical forms of prayer, all good. I think if you really want to develop this capacity in yourself, go be with other people. That's what Pascal said in Pascal's Wager, which is not really about heaven or hell at all. It's much more this very honest, beautiful. I have this huge intellectual crush on Pascal. It is beautiful. He's having this argument with himself. This evidence points this way. This evidence points this way. What should I do? He's basically like, go to church. Go be with people who believe, because we know that beliefs are caught, not taught. Or everything we know about how we come to conclusions is in relationships, etc., etc. So basically, don't try and do it on your own. Join something.
Yeah. I was really struck by that part of your book. I wasn't aware of that aspect of Pascal's life. And, I think, as he put it, was something like, go spend time with people who've solved the problems you're trying to solve. Or, there's something about the modeling yourself after those who have shown the path in some way, right?
Yeah.
And
we have this and it's a legacy of a particular kind of Protestant evangelism. We have this kind of, I can't show up in a religious congregation unless I believe these following things. But frankly, half of the people in that religious congregation won't believe all those things on any given day anyway. I don't, not half the time, but some of the time. It is much more about what am I committing myself to pay attention to? Who do I want to be becoming, and where am I most likely to be becoming that person? On the days where I don't believe any of this, I still go to church because I think that is the path that's going to help me become the kind of person the world needs and the kind of person I want to grow up into. But there's this beautiful line. He says, okay, go to church, be with people who already believe this, but what are you afraid of? So it's this dialogue between himself that in so doing, I will come to believe. Isn't that what you want? And there's this I don't want to be conned. What if, isn't that fake? Shouldn't I be able to get there on my own? And again, I think this understanding of what attention is like and how we actually change our mind, which is not usually working out a hypothesis in our head, but in relationship and in community and through the testimony of people that we trust, really helps people just relax about all of that.
Yeah. There's a lot in what you're saying here that I think applies to one aspect of our current crisis, which is polarization. and there's, some interesting research by the Polarization Lab at Duke that, has tried to expose people to different perspectives. And it seems that they only get more entrenched in their beliefs if they're exposed to other perspectives. I want to ask you a little bit about how we become peacemakers and how we move from just hanging out with, people like me to people who are not like me. And you say a lot about that in your chapter on wrath. But I want to first ask you for the excellent story that you shared about getting onto the bus and being confronted by this lady while you're sitting with your child. Could you share that story? Because I just found that incredibly striking, and there's a lot that we could learn from over there.
Yes. Yeah, I think I'm understanding how much we all have this instinctive preference for people like ourselves. It's called homophily in the literature. I call it people like me syndrome. But how much it's exacerbated and accelerated by fight or flight and by, frankly, being tired and grumpy and like having low resources. And so this was one day when I was, our kids are quite young and we didn't have a car. And I was picking one of them up from nursery and one of them up from school. Maybe they were even younger than that. And I got on a bus and it was empty and I sat one child on their own seat, either side of me. And a woman got on the bus and she was so rude. And she said, move your child. And I was like, there's all these free seats. And there's another free seat over there. And she said, I want to sit there. Move your child. I was just like, wow, okay. Dragged my very large toddler onto my lap and said, and this, I'm really embarrassed about this. I was so snarky. I was like, I am trying to teach my children good manners. You could use a please or a thank you. And then she sat down and we sat there. And I don't know if you've ever had this, but I was just so full of rage. Just like, how dare you? I wish I'd said no, muttering to myself, basically. And I could feel her tension, right? And her annoyance. And there was both of us in this like confined space, super stressed. And for whatever reason, I'd been reading about this parenting technique of do-overs, and I knew we had a while to go on this bus. And I thought, I don't want to sit here feeling this disgusting rage and resentment. So I just said, should we start again? My name's Elizabeth. What's your name? And it completely transformed the situation. She laughed. It released, it's discharged some of the stress hormone, I think is what it does. It's unexpected. And she told me her name and I said, where do you live? And we got chatting and she'd been to the hospital and she was in pain, and her particular type of pain I have experienced. So we had something in common, right? And then vulnerability gets in the mix. And we had a really lovely conversation. And towards the end of the bus journey, the bus had super filled up. And I don't know if you have this, but on London buses, there's an area where you park your buggies. Strollers, do you call them strollers? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And someone had got on and there was always 2 strollers there. Someone else had got on and they were like shoving the stroller around and they're like, who's this? And I couldn't get out because I had a kid on my lap and it was too crowded in. And the woman next to me just was like, would you give her a minute? She's doing her best.
It's amazing.
So we left the bus having completely transformed it because of this very simple thing of just being willing to change the dynamic a little bit.
Yeah. How have you seen that kind of transformation play out, either in the communities you're in or elsewhere in the world? Is how can we actually, in these polarized times where we don't want to trust other people, we've got fixed opinions in the U.S. now. We have elections coming up pretty soon. I think this is intensifying. Is there anything we could learn in that, in terms of moving in that direction?
Yeah, lots. I mean, this is the podcast that I host trying to model this, and I think it is one of those strange things that's actually. It's a really simple thing in us and we can take very simple steps, but there is no scaffolding for it and there is no teaching around it. But I summarize as the 2 things you need to know is homophily, which is people like me syndrome. Everyone prefers people who remind them of themselves. It's a constant across cultures and centuries. It doesn't make you a terrible person. You have to keep an eye on it and be deliberately spending time with people not like yourself and listening to people not like yourself and noticing in you the ridiculous preferences of people who like wear the same glasses as you or remind you of, I saw someone with on the train the other day was using the same brand of pen that I really like and seek out. And my brain went, they seem like a good person, right? It's ridiculous, but we all do it and we need to keep an eye on it. Mm-hmm. And the way that fight or flight increases our homophily, like accelerates our desire for people like ourselves. And so the way that we change that is we notice when we're triggered and we do this thing that Jesus talked about, which is turning the other cheek. And turning the other cheek is really enigmatic phrase if you're not someone that gets hit in the face. Like, it comes from when someone strikes you in the face, turn the other cheek. It's really famous, but it's really hard to know how to apply if you're not regularly being struck in the face. And I came to understand it as a very deliberate, quite badass way that we can respond to any situation of threat, social discomfort, conflict. Because when someone attacks you, demeans you, disagrees with you, dismisses your identity or your tribe or your group or your political position, we get a flood of stress hormone triggered into fight or flight. I won't go into freeze and fawn. And the natural reaction is therefore to attack back or to withdraw into our tribes and our parallel communities. And what turning the other cheek means is keeping the conversation open, keeping the relationship open, keeping the connection open. And what that often cashes out into is, rather than responding with anger, asking a question, help me understand. I can hear you're angry, or would you like to come for dinner? Which is where I usually land.
That's great. I want to ask you a little bit about the move from greed to generosity and gratitude. And this again, I think, is one aspect of our crisis we're in. And going back to Hartmut Rosa, he talks about this constant situation we're in of wanting more and more things to be available to us and then accessible and attainable, right? So we're in this rat race because we're constantly chasing after attaining those things that are increasingly becoming accessible to us in the world, right? And there are many ways in which I think you're suggesting that religious communities and practices and traditions can help us put a stop to this constant chasing. Could you say a little bit about the practices and decisions you've made in order to make this move from avarice to gratitude and generosity?
I mean, I feel like I'm a hypocrite in all these areas. This is the worst. I feel like such a beginner. The way we've set up an economic story to be repeatedly accelerating our avarice means I think we're all formed into being hypocrites. And Oliver James, who is not religious at all, as far as I know, talks about this a lot in Affluenza, that one of the key ways that he talks about affluenza as a virus, this insatiable hunger for more and more and more, and never being satisfied with enough, having no concept of enough, that forms of religious practice are one of the only known antidotes to affluenza. Because the claim, and it's a truth claim, of my tradition is not only that money won't make you happy, but that it is dangerous for your soul. Like, Christianity in particular is like radically ambivalent about money and wealth in particular. Love of money is the root of all evil. There's ways you can nuance these verses, but looked at as straightforwardly as you can, the accumulation of wealth is bad for us. And I still want to accumulate wealth, but I at least am attempting to be formed by a story that is calling that into question and reminding me what actually helps me flourish, which again, we know from the positive psychology literature, which basically agrees with religion, which is deep relationships, being in community, which again, collective religious practice helps you with, sense of meaning and purpose in your life, a level of freedom and health, which actually randomly religious people do tend to be healthier. We're not quite sure what the mechanism is there. So yes, that kind of like the way religion has some claims about what a good life is and what's important, and it's not getting rich, and then continually reminds you of it and gives you rituals and practices and forms of attention to be acting as some kind of antidote to the economic story, is where I think its power lies in this area.
Yeah. No, it's really helpful for you to to talk about the way in which, again, living in community with other people forces you to, share details about your economic lives or even make decisions to tithe. And I think you had mentioned you would stop buying new clothing, for instance. And those are all very challenging practices for, I think, most of us to think about. But I do think it's, something like that seems to be needed to put the brakes on the constant, hamster wheel we're on. I want to ask a little bit about pride and the movement to, out of individualism. You quote Oliver Burkeman, who says that freedom is to be found not in achieving greater sovereignty over your own schedule, but in allowing yourself to be constrained by the rhythms of community, participating in forms of social life where you don't get to decide exactly what you do or when you do it. It sounds really paradoxical, right? How do you achieve freedom by submitting to constraint and especially, almost subjecting yourself to other people, right? And again, it seems in our individualistic times, this is really an affront to many of us. But what has your experience been of living in community and how you found freedom in this experience?
Yeah, it is, isn't it? It's one of the most entrenched lies that we tell about what a good life is. More autonomy. Another thing that Oliver Burkeman says is that the way that cashes out in our society is the freedom to never see your friends, right? All that autonomy leaves us immensely lonely. And if, as I believe, we are made for each other and we are made by each other, we are relational into our bones. And you can do that through your Trinitarian theological anthropology, but you can also do it through sociology, understanding of mirror neurons. There are many, many ways that we are coming to know that we are, that there is a myth of the individual.
Yeah.
Just we're more like those trees with all the roots connected under the surface. Right. Yeah. So living in community has involved releasing some autonomy over my time. We have some really quite rigorous commitments to each other. We get up and do morning prayer. We do compline. Wednesday night is house night. Friday morning, we read the Bible together. Once a month, we have a house day that we spend together. Monday evenings, we host big open table dinners. I'd say a third of my time every week is spent with commitments to this very small community and what we want to do together, which restricts other bits of my life. But I have felt like I've grown up my soul more living in community for 3 years than the previous 20 years. And it is one of those claims of religion that doesn't make much sense outside that imaginative world. But my experience is that in creating some covenant commitments to the things I want to be defining my life and the things I want to be being formed by, I feel more free. It's weird.
Yeah. I think it's a challenge even for people in religious communities. One of the research projects we did, we found that people who are really active in their faith communities in the US anyway, rarely share their personal struggles and problems with others in their faith community. And so there's maybe a desire to keep up appearances or just no clear sort of practices, right? No sort of mechanisms by which one would do that. Where we found some variation there, we found that it was the Catholic and Jewish communities that did the worst, and the best were the African-American Protestants, Black Baptists in particular, who have practices of coming together and asking for prayer and receiving prayer, right? So you don't share problems as venting, but as an experience where someone loves you. And I think we have a lot to learn about the kinds of practices, even in faith communities, that are genuinely going to foster connection and vulnerability, because the church can be a really alienating experience for a lot of people.
Yeah. Can I offer a hypothesis about that?
Yeah.
I think you should do some cross-tabulation around economics, because I write about it in the avarice chapter. I think that one of the things that disconnects us is the reason that money is warned against is for, I'm sure, reasons that I don't understand, but I have come to believe that it's because it relationally distances us from each other, because we don't need each other and we are designed to meet each other's needs. And what kind of this stage of capitalism does is encourages us to be able to meet all of our own needs and find our own safety, because other people are annoying, frankly, and it's difficult being vulnerable and asking for help. And if, as my understandings are correct, the kind of Black Baptist populations in the US have historically been poorer, then the context of interdependence that's economic may be as important as the practices and the postures and the theology for helping them actually show up and know themselves and see and be seen and love and be loved.
Yeah, no, that's something for us to look into. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm just giving you tasks in things I'm interested in.
It's great. No, it's very helpful. Yeah, no, this is, we have, we're trying to figure out, make sense of the mechanisms too, right? And to understand, is it, would we find differences in wealthier communities and maybe more of a desire to keep people away? Certainly their houses are bigger and further distanced from each other, so that itself communicates something. And that envy
status thing, we are formed by a story about not wanting or needing help. And I think that's sort of what sin is, really.
Right. Yeah. What have you learned? You have it, a lot of people in your community who come to your dinners are not people of faith. Are there ways in which people who are believers and non-believers can learn from each other when it comes to this longing for wholeness, living a fully human life?
I just think listening is the heart of everything good. And it's annoying because it sounds so boring, and it's really not boring. I believe that a good, honest question is a holy thing, and that asking each other real questions and then really listening to what is beneath the surface of each other. I have almost no tolerance for small talk. It means I'm quite intense in person. I think I'm sometimes a bit too intense, but the thing that happens at our dinners often is that we just get into actual heart-to-heart conversations about the things that mean the most to us. And then we listen to each other, and no one's like, I am right and you are wrong, and, turn or burn. It's much more we are meaning-seeking creatures with these longings, and we don't always know what to do with them, but we're probably better working it out together than we are doing it apart.
Yeah. You leave the God question towards the end of the book, and you have God in square brackets throughout. Could you say a bit about that choice, and perhaps how do people who may have been hurt by religion or by a concept of God, what do you recommend for people who are in that position?
Yeah. Oh, it's such a tender thing. Like, I have much of that in my story. And some days I'm like, how can there be any goodness in here given the absolute institutional carnage, right? And the repeated failure of Christians in public, and then Christians like myself, right? I put the God word in square brackets because it is the most semiotically dense 3 letters in the English language. And I think assuming that everyone means the same thing by it is foolish. And we're all dragging our associations into that gap. And I'm really aware that for a lot of people, I sort of want to have a duty of care to the reader. Like, I remember what it was like when I was at least trying to be an atheist. I remember what it was like before I was a Christian. And you can set off an emotional firestorm. This question of, is there love? Is there a logic of love in the universe? Like, am I seen? Is there justice? It doesn't look like it a lot of the time, right? These are very tender, complex, intimate, private questions. And so I left it to last because I wanted to build up trust in the reader that I wasn't going to take those bruises or those risks glibly.
Yeah.
And that we would treat it with care and with, I hope, appropriate humility of so much I don't claim to know any of it. I think having been out of the church and then in it and then out of it and now like sort of slightly reluctantly and grumpily, but properly in it again, I always come back to whom else shall we go? I've sort of looked everywhere else for wisdom. And this path seems to be the one most likely to make me feel fully alive and fully human, that there's treasure in the rubble and we can focus on that bit.
Yeah, thank you. I realize you have to run. Is there anything you'd like to add in terms of maybe a question that you wish people would ask you about the book that people haven't yet, or anything else you want to leave us with?
No, we don't have time for it, but it's hilarious to me that I've written a whole chapter on lust, which is very direct about the Christian sexual ethic and very frank, and no one is brave enough to go there. So I would say, if you are interested in sex, go read that bit. But but otherwise, no. Thank you for your beautiful and thoughtful questions. It's been really fun.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's been a delight. And where can we direct our viewers and listeners to your work?
So I have a Substack, More Fully Alive, at substack.com, The Sacred Podcast, or buy the book. Perfect.
And yeah, Elizabeth Oldfield, Fully Alive. I highly recommend it. Thank you so much for joining us again. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, folks, that's a wrap for this episode. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with someone who would find it of interest. Also, please subscribe and leave us a review if you haven't already. Thanks, and see you next time.